My name is Scott Bennett. I'm 63 years old, retired after 38 years as a highway maintenance supervisor just outside Columbus, Ohio. Most of my life was measured in miles of asphalt, snowstorms that started before sunrise, and long summers spent repairing roads so strangers could get home safely. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest. I always believed that if a man kept his promises, paid his bills, and showed up when people needed him, life would eventually return the favor. Looking back now, I realize I understood roads far better than I ever understood people. Cracks in pavement announce themselves. Families are quieter. They split apart one invisible fracture at a time until one ordinary afternoon you discover the bridge you've trusted for years has already collapsed beneath your feet. My daughter Lauren was the center of my world from the day she was born. After my wife passed away, it became just the two of us for a long time. I learned how to braid hair by watching videotapes because I didn't want Lauren going to elementary school looking like her father had no idea what he was doing. I burned plenty of dinners before I figured out recipes she actually liked. I never missed a parent-teacher conference, every softball game, every dance recital, every graduation ceremony. There were years when I worked overtime simply so she wouldn't have to grow up feeling that losing her mother meant losing opportunities too. Every extra shift felt worth it whenever she smiled. I never thought of it as sacrifice. That's simply what fathers do. You don't keep score with your children. At least I never did. When Lauren met Ethan, I genuinely wanted to like him. He was polite enough, ambitious enough, always talking about plans for the future. He had big ideas, endless confidence, and a talent for making every conversation sound like a business presentation. At first I admired that. Young people are supposed to dream bigger than the generation before them. I told myself his confidence would balance Lauren's cautious nature. During family dinners he loved discussing housing markets, investment opportunities, mortgage rates, and neighborhoods that were supposedly about to explode in value. I listened without saying much. My world had always been simple. Buy what you can afford. Save for what you can't. Sleep better because nobody owns tomorrow except the bank. 2 years ago they came to my house one Sunday afternoon carrying a folder instead of dessert. I remember that detail because Lauren always used to bring my favorite apple pie whenever she visited. That day there was no pie, just paperwork. Ethan spread documents across my kitchen table while Lauren sat quietly beside him, twisting her wedding ring around her finger. They had finally found the perfect house, they explained. Great neighborhood. Excellent schools for the children they hoped to have someday. Prices were climbing fast. If they didn't buy immediately, they'd never get another chance. There was only one problem. Their income wasn't quite enough for the mortgage approval. The bank wanted another signature. Lauren reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Dad, we wouldn't ask if there were any other way. I didn't even finish reading every page before saying yes. People can call that foolish if they want. I call it being a father. I trusted my daughter more than I trusted paperwork. The loan officer explained my responsibilities carefully. If they stopped paying, I would be legally responsible. My credit would be affected. My retirement could be placed at risk. I nodded through every warning because none of it seemed important. I wasn't thinking about legal language. I was thinking about the little girl who used to fall asleep in the passenger seat while I drove us home from softball tournaments. I was thinking about Christmas mornings when she ran downstairs before sunrise. I was thinking about every promise I'd ever silently made to protect her, no matter how old she became. So I signed. Lauren cried. She hugged me tighter than she had in years. Ethan shook my hand twice and called me family. Funny how easily that word is spoken when someone needs your signature. The first year after they bought the house felt normal enough. I helped paint bedrooms. I spent entire weekends installing shelves in the garage. Ethan and I built a backyard deck together, though I noticed he spent more time explaining his vision than holding the other end of the lumber. I laughed it off. That's what retirement is for, I figured. Helping your kids build something they'll enjoy long after you're gone. Then the conversations slowly changed. Every visit became shorter. Every phone call had a purpose. Whenever Lauren called, I could almost predict the direction before she reached it. Dad, what do you think our house is worth now? Dad, Ethan thinks refinancing could free up equity. Dad, we're considering remodeling because it'll increase resale value. It wasn't just that they talked about money. It was that they rarely talked about anything else. When I suggested meeting for lunch, they were busy. When I invited them over for Sunday dinner, something always came up. But if paperwork needed signing, if financial advice was required, or if something expensive suddenly broke inside the house, somehow they always found time. I kept making excuses for them. They're young. They're building their future. Life is expensive. Don't take it personally. The hardest lies to recognize are the ones you tell yourself. Then came the afternoon that finally stripped away every excuse I'd spent years inventing. I drove over without calling first, carrying a small toolbox because Lauren had mentioned weeks earlier that one of the kitchen cabinet doors wasn't closing properly. It wasn't urgent. She had probably forgotten about it. But old habits die hard. If something needed fixing for my daughter, I fixed it. I pulled into the driveway and immediately noticed something different. The front door looked newer. The brass hardware reflected the afternoon sunlight. As I climbed the porch steps, I slipped my key into the lock. It didn't fit. For a second, I honestly thought I had picked up the wrong key. I stood there on Lauren's front porch, turning the old brass key between my fingers as though years of habit had somehow worn the teeth down. I tried again, slower this time, making sure it slid completely into the lock. It stopped halfway. I pulled it back out, looked at it, tried once more. Nothing. That was when I noticed the fresh screws around the deadbolt and the polished handle that certainly hadn't been there a month earlier. The hardware still looked brand new, untouched by weather or fingerprints. Someone had changed every lock on the house, and nobody had thought to mention it to me. I knocked. Not hard. Just enough for whoever was inside to hear. A few seconds passed before I caught movement through the frosted glass. Then the inner door opened, leaving only the screen door between Lauren and me. She looked calm. Too calm. There wasn't even a flicker of surprise on her face. Dad. I smiled automatically. Looks like I picked a bad day to stop by. No, she answered quietly. We're just busy. I lifted the toolbox slightly. You mentioned the cabinet door wasn't closing right. I figured I'd fix it while I was in the neighborhood. Her eyes dropped toward the toolbox before lifting back to mine. We already had someone take care of it. I nodded. Well, that's good. Another silence settled between us. The kind that grows heavier every second because both people know something has changed, but only one of them knows why. Finally, I looked toward the new lock. So, you changed the hardware. We did. You forgot to tell me. She hesitated. Then she folded her arms. It wasn't really something we needed to announce. I stared at her. Not because of the locks. Because of the distance in her voice. It sounded polite, professional, like she was speaking to a salesman who had arrived without an appointment instead of the man who had raised her. I still had a key. I know. Another pause. Then she said the sentence that replayed in my head for weeks afterward. Dad. It's my name on the mailbox now. No anger. No shouting. Just certainty. As though that one sentence explained everything. As though the mailbox somehow erased the mortgage documents sitting in a bank vault with my signature across the bottom. I looked past her shoulder. The family pictures still hung in the hallway. The rocking chair that had belonged to Lauren's mother still sat beside the living room window because I had insisted she take it after buying the house. Even the grandfather clock I had spent 3 weekends restoring stood against the far wall. Pieces of my life filled every room. I simply wasn't welcome among them anymore. I wanted to ask when everything had changed. I wanted to ask why she hadn't simply told me she wanted boundaries instead of replacing the locks without a conversation. I wanted to ask whether Ethan was standing somewhere behind the corner listening. Instead, I smiled. A tired smile. I understand. I'm not sure she expected that answer. Her shoulders relaxed, almost with relief. Maybe she had spent days preparing for an argument that never came. Maybe she expected me to remind her that without my credit, that house would never have belonged to anyone. Instead, I turned around, carried my toolbox back to the truck, and drove away. I never looked in the rearview mirror. The drive home took almost 40 minutes. I don't remember a single traffic light. I don't remember the radio. I don't even remember passing through downtown Columbus. My hands stayed steady on the steering wheel, but my thoughts refused to settle. I kept hearing one sentence. Is my name on the mailbox now? Funny thing about words. Sometimes they don't hurt because of what they say. They hurt because of what they reveal. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat inside the truck with the engine running for several minutes. The house felt larger than usual. Empty houses always do. After my wife died, I eventually grew accustomed to the silence. This silence was different. It wasn't loneliness. It was realization. I carried the untouched toolbox back inside, set it beside the garage wall, and made myself a pot of coffee even though it was nearly 4 in the afternoon. Old habits have a way of calming restless minds. I poured a cup, sat at the kitchen table where Lauren had signed college applications years earlier, and stared at the family photographs lining the opposite wall. Every picture told the same story. Birthday candles, fishing trips, graduations, Christmas mornings. None of them warned me about the ending. Finally, I picked up my phone and called the bank. After verifying my identity, the representative pulled up the mortgage file. "Yes, Mr. Bennett," she said pleasantly. "You're currently listed as an active cosigner on the loan. I just wanted to confirm. You're fully responsible under the agreement should the primary borrower's default." Responsible. Interesting word. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I sat perfectly still. Lauren had removed my key. She had removed my access. She had removed me from her front porch. But she hadn't removed my legal responsibility. She wanted the security of my name, just not the inconvenience of my presence. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me clear. And clarity is a dangerous thing. Because once you finally stop making excuses for people, you start seeing every warning sign you ignored along the way. Suddenly, every conversation over the last several years returned with painful precision. Every discussion about equity. Every joke Ethan made about property values. Every phone call that somehow ended with another financial favor. Every canceled dinner. Every forgotten birthday visit. Every promise that they'd come by next weekend. I had mistaken convenience for love. I had confused dependence with closeness. And somewhere along the way, my daughter had stopped seeing me as her father. Without either of us noticing, I had slowly become part of the financing. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives wearing a mask. By the time you finally recognize it, it has usually been sitting across the dinner table for years. That afternoon, after hanging up with the bank, I didn't feel angry. I didn't slam my coffee mug onto the table. I didn't curse Ethan's name or convince myself Lauren had suddenly become someone I didn't recognize. The truth was harder than that. She hadn't changed overnight. I had simply ignored every sign because fathers have an incredible talent for confusing hope with reality. I leaned back in my chair and let the memories come without trying to stop them. Once I stopped defending them in my own mind, everything looked different. The first memory that surfaced was Lauren's birthday 3 years earlier. I'd spent almost an entire Saturday smoking brisket in the backyard because it was her favorite. I invited her and Ethan over for dinner weeks in advance. She promised they'd be there by 4. At 3:30, my phone buzzed. "Dad, something came up." That was all she said. No explanation. No offer to come later. Just another rain check. An hour after that cancellation, Ethan uploaded pictures to social media. The two of them were touring open houses. I remember sitting alone at the picnic table long after the food had gone cold, convincing myself they had probably scheduled the appointment months in advance. Now I wondered why I had been making excuses on their behalf instead of simply accepting the obvious. Another memory surfaced. Christmas. Lauren had always spent Christmas morning with me after her mother passed away. It became our tradition. Coffee before sunrise. Cinnamon rolls in the oven. Old family ornaments that somehow survived every move we'd ever made. Then Ethan entered the picture. The first Christmas after they married, they arrived around noon. The second year they stopped by for 20 minutes. The third year they didn't come at all. Instead, Lauren called around dinner. "Merry Christmas, Dad. Sorry today got away from us." I told her not to worry. I always told her not to worry. Funny how parents spend their entire lives making sure their children never feel guilty. Sometimes that kindness teaches the wrong lesson. Then there was the furnace. That one still stung. It had stopped working in the middle of January during one of the coldest weeks Ohio had seen in years. Lauren sounded panicked. "Dad, we don't know what to do." I was at their house 45 minutes later. The repair company quoted a price that made Ethan whistle under his breath. Without even being asked, I offered to cover half. Lauren hugged me. Ethan thanked me. A week later, I invited them over for dinner. They were suddenly too busy. Not because they were working, because they were celebrating with friends. The pattern repeated itself over and over until I stopped counting. Whenever they needed help, I was family. Whenever life was comfortable again, I became optional. Somehow I never noticed how predictable it had become. Or maybe I noticed and simply refused to admit it. The following morning I woke before sunrise, just as I had for most of my working life. Retirement hadn't changed my internal clock. Coffee, toast, the local news playing softly in the background. Only this time my routine felt different. Not because anything around me had changed, because something inside me had. For years my schedule revolved around Lauren. If she called asking for help, I rearranged everything. If Ethan needed another pair of hands, I drove across town. If they hinted at another project, another repair, another problem, I was already reaching for my truck keys before they finished explaining. I had built my retirement around being available. Available at any moment, for any reason, whether I was invited into their lives or not. That realization bothered me more than the changed locks. I wasn't living my own retirement. I was living on standby, waiting for the next request, the next emergency, the next favor disguised as family. Around mid-morning I walked into the garage. My old fishing boat sat exactly where I'd left it nearly 2 years earlier beneath a faded canvas cover. I pulled the cover back. Dust covered the windshield. Spiderwebs stretched between the trailer frame and the garage wall. I laughed quietly to myself. Not because anything was funny, because I suddenly realized I'd neglected the things that once brought me peace while making endless time for people who rarely made time for me. I ran my hand across the faded blue paint. This old girl deserves better. So did I. That afternoon I cleaned the boat for the first time in months. I polished the chrome, checked the wiring, made a list of replacement parts. For several hours I thought about nothing except sandpaper, fiberglass, and fresh paint. It felt peaceful. No phone calls, no discussions about mortgages, no conversations about refinancing, just honest work. The kind of work where every improvement could actually be seen. By evening my back ached, my hands were dirty, and for the first time in weeks I felt oddly content. Then my phone rang. Lauren. I looked at the screen. It rang until voicemail answered. She didn't leave a message. A minute later Ethan called. I watched that one ring too. No message. Then silence. If it had happened a week earlier, I would have called them back immediately. I would have worried that something terrible had happened. Instead, I simply placed my phone back on the workbench. Whatever they needed could wait. For once, I wasn't going to rearrange my life before even knowing why they were calling. Because somewhere between the changed locks and the quiet inside my garage, I had begun to understand something that should have been obvious years earlier. A man who is only valued when he is useful isn't being loved. He's being managed. The next morning I made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to call Lauren. I wasn't going to drive back to her house. I wasn't going to ask why the locks had been changed or whether Ethan had talked her into it. For years I had been the one chasing every uncomfortable conversation, smoothing over every awkward moment, convincing myself that peace was always worth the price. This time I wanted something different. I wanted the truth. And the truth didn't require another family discussion. It required paperwork. Around 9 o'clock, I put on a clean button-down shirt, gathered every document related to the mortgage from my filing cabinet, and drove to the local branch where the loan had originally been processed. The folder wasn't thick, but it represented one of the biggest financial commitments I had ever made. Every page carried my signature. Every signature had been given freely because I believed I was helping my daughter build a secure future. Now I needed to understand exactly what that commitment still meant. The same loan officer wasn't there anymore. Retirement changes more than your own life. It changes everyone else's too. A younger woman greeted me with a professional smile and invited me into her office. "What can I help you with today, Mr. Bennett?" I placed the folder on her desk. "I co-signed a mortgage for my daughter 2 years ago." She nodded while opening my account. "I'd like to understand every legal responsibility that still belongs to me." She spent several minutes reviewing the file. When she finally looked back at me, her expression had become more serious. "You're still fully obligated under the loan. I expected that. If the payments stop, you're equally responsible." "I understand." She folded her hands together. "Is something happening with the property?" For a moment I considered telling her everything. The changed locks, the screen door, Lauren's calm voice reminding me whose name sat on the mailbox. Instead, I simply answered with the truth. "I've realized my legal responsibilities don't match my actual relationship with the homeowners." She didn't ask any more personal questions. Professionals rarely do. Instead, she explained something I hadn't known. Because of the specific loan program Lauren and Ethan had used, there were refinancing provisions that could eventually remove a cosigner if certain financial conditions were met. It wasn't automatic. It required documentation, qualification, and formal requests. But the possibility existed. I listened carefully, not because I intended to make any decisions that morning, because I wanted knowledge instead of assumptions. Too many mistakes begin with people acting before they understand the rules. I thanked her for her time and left with a small stack of informational documents tucked neatly inside my folder. Outside, I sat in my truck without starting the engine. For years I had assumed I was trapped. Now I knew I had options. There is an enormous difference between those two things. Options give a man back his dignity. Driving home, I noticed something unusual. I wasn't replaying Lauren's words anymore. Instead, I was thinking about my own future. Not theirs, mine. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten I was retired. Retirement wasn't supposed to mean waiting beside the telephone for my daughter to need another favor. It wasn't supposed to mean measuring my weeks by someone else's schedule. When I reached home, I pulled into the garage and looked at the fishing boat again. Yesterday I had cleaned it. Today I started repairing it. The trailer lights needed rewiring. The outboard motor deserved a complete inspection. The faded registration numbers would have to be replaced before spring. Hours slipped past without me noticing. My hands became stained with grease. My knees complained every time I stood up. I smiled more than I had in months. Work has a strange honesty to it. If you tighten the right bolt, the engine runs better. If you sand the surface carefully, the paint holds. There are no hidden motives, no emotional negotiations, only cause and effect. By late afternoon, my phone buzzed again. Lauren. This time she left a voicemail. "Hi, Dad. Just calling to see how you're doing. Give me a call when you get a chance." Nothing about the locks. Nothing about my visit. Nothing about the awkward conversation that had somehow ended with me standing outside her front door. Just a casual message pretending nothing had happened. I listened to it twice. Then I placed the phone back into my pocket. If she wanted to talk about weather, television shows, or grocery shopping, she could have called anyone. If she wanted to repair what had happened between us, she already knew where to begin. That evening I drove across town to a community workshop run by local veterans. Years earlier, a friend had invited me to volunteer there after retirement, repairing lawn equipment, trailers, generators, and small engines for veterans who couldn't afford expensive repairs. I had always said I was too busy. Too busy. The words almost made me laugh. Busy doing what? Waiting. The workshop smelled like machine oil, old wood, and fresh coffee. The kind of place where nobody cared what your previous job title had been. They only cared whether you were willing to help. An older Marine handed me a carburetor without asking many questions. "Think you can save this thing?" I turned it over in my hands. I've seen worse. He grinned. I like optimistic people. For the next 3 hours we worked side by side, talking about fishing, grandchildren, retirement, bad knees, and Ohio winters. Nobody asked whether I had co-signed a mortgage. Nobody wanted financial advice. Nobody needed another favor. They simply appreciated that I had shown up. Driving home that night, I realized something that unsettled me almost as much as it comforted me. I had spent one evening with complete strangers, and felt more respected than I had during my last dozen visits to my daughter's house. That realization stayed with me long after I turned off the lights. Because respect isn't measured by how often someone says they love you. It's measured by whether they make room for you, or simply expect you to make room for them.